Have you ever wondered what happens when a smile becomes a weapon and order transforms into oppression? Dolores Umbridge, with her forced sweetness and relentless rules, shows us a type of control that goes far beyond fiction. Beneath that rosy face and impeccable robes, a mind pulsates that makes us question, what truly drives a person to impose their power with such rigidity? Get ready, because what we are about to uncover today might change the way you see the pursuit of authority. In the vast and complex universe of Harry Potter, while Voldemort's shadow loomed with its explicit darkness and unquestionable direct violence, Dolores Umbridge emerged as a fundamentally different kind of danger, more subtle, insidious, and for many, even more disturbing due to her apparent normalcy. She enters the scene as the senior undersecretary to the Minister for Magic, a figure who, at first glance, embodies bureaucracy in its most trivial form and apparent respectability. However, this facade of sweetness and conformity hides the tip of an iceberg of control, deeply ingrained prejudice, and authoritarianism. Her environment of origin and ascent is the Ministry of Magic, an institution that, although conceived to safeguard order, justice, and the safety of the wizarding community, was beginning to bend under the influence of ideologies of segregation, blood purity, and a growing paranoia regarding anyone who dared to challenge the status quo or the official narrative. The ground for the flourishing and ascent of a figure with Umbridge's psychological and behavioral characteristics is fertile within a system that, by its very nature and structure, excessively values hierarchy, blind conformity, and unquestioning obedience above all else. She's not an isolated anomaly or an unexpected deviation. She is, in many respects, the logical product of an environment that permits, and even encourages, the suppression of dissenting voices and the imposition of a singular vision. Umbridge represents the embodiment of a mind desperately seeking security and predictability through the rigorous imposition of norms, the standardization of behaviors, and the systematic elimination of any deviation or difference. In psychology, this inclination can be understood as a deep and often unconscious need for control, frequently originating from an underlying desire to avoid chaos, uncertainty, ambiguity, or anything perceived as threatening and disorganized. Individuals with this predisposition may view diversity, individuality, spontaneity, or critical thinking as direct threats to social cohesion and the established order they so cherish. For them, the solution to these problems is to standardize, regulate, and, if necessary, repress the behavior of others to maintain a sense of stability and ironclad control. For Umbridge, order is not merely an abstract concept or a goal to be achieved. It is an obsession, an ideology that justifies each of her actions, no matter how cruel, unjust, or inhumane they may be. She believes, with unshakable conviction, that she is acting for the greater good, to protect the purity, tradition, and normality of a world that, in her distorted view, is constantly under threat from undesirable and dangerous elements. Her aversion to everything different, be it a half-giant, a mudblood, or a teacher who encourages independent thought, is the very foundation of her ideology. But there was something no one saw coming. The intensity of her conviction, the depth of her intolerance, and how far she would go to achieve her distorted vision of order, transforming bureaucracy into a silent yet devastating tool of oppression that infiltrated every aspect of life. Dolores Umbridge's arrival at Hogwarts is not a mere bureaucratic relocation or a routine job assignment. It is, in fact, the explosive catalyst for her true form of control to emerge and manifest in a brutal and systematic manner. The Ministry of Magic, already in a dangerous state of denial and self-deception regarding Voldemort's return and the imminent threat he posed, saw in Albus Dumbledore not just a political dissident, but a direct threat to their authority, their official narrative of fabricated peace and stability, and their control over information. In this climate of fear, misinformation, and the search for scapegoats, Umbridge emerges as the perfect tool, the embodiment of the Ministry's will to exert its influence and, more importantly, silence dissenting voices within the most important and influential wizarding educational institution, imposing a single, unquestionable narrative. Her transformation from an apparently harmless bureaucrat, with her penchant for pink hues and decorative kittens, to High Inquisitor of Hogwarts, illustrates in a frightening way how power, when unchecked, when granted to minds predisposed to authoritarianism and intolerance, can amplify oppressive tendencies and lead to tyranny. She is not content with merely teaching or supervising. She begins to dismantle and transform what was a vibrant educational structure, open to knowledge and critical thinking, into a machine of indoctrination, censorship, and ideological control. The conflict is evident and painful, a clash of philosophies. On one side, freedom of thought, the pursuit of truth, the encouragement of individuality, and preparation for the grim reality promoted by Dumbledore and his supporters. On the other, rigidity, censorship, denial of reality, and the imposition of blind, unquestioning obedience by Umbridge. From a psychological perspective, this transformation can be analyzed through the lens of conformity theory and obedience to authority, but also the psychology of power and corruption. Individuals with an authoritarian personality tend to be more rigid in their beliefs, conventional in their attitudes, and to excessively value hierarchy, order, and discipline. When granted power, and especially when that power is legitimized by a superior authority, they may feel not only justified, but obligated to impose their beliefs and rules, even if it causes suffering, humiliation, psychological or physical harm. Furthermore, cognitive dissonance plays a crucial and dangerous role. To justify her increasingly severe, cruel, and inhumane actions, Umbridge needs to firmly believe that she is acting for the greater good, to protect students and wizarding society from dangerous ideas and subversive elements. This belief leads her to reinforce her convictions, distort reality, and reject or ignore any evidence to the contrary, creating a vicious cycle of self-justification and escalating oppression. She does not perceive evil in herself or her actions, but projects it onto others, onto those who refuse to submit to her order. And it was there that everything began to crumble for the freedom of Hogwarts, under the baton of a symphony of educational decrees, each one more restrictive, more oppressive, and more inhumane than the last, paving the way for an era of fear, silence, and indoctrination. The school, once a refuge, became an ideological prison. Dolores Umbridge's mind is not chaotic, disorganized, or irrational in the common sense of the word. It is, in fact, frighteningly organized, methodical, and logical within its own system of distorted and prejudiced beliefs. Her speeches, her decisions, and her attitudes reveal a way of thinking where order, discipline, tradition, and purity are the unshakable pillars of a worldview that rejects complexity, diversity, individual freedom, and, above all, inconvenient truth. The educational decree that prohibits any inconvenient truth or the use of practical magic for self-defense, for example, is not just an arbitrary rule or a whim. It is the direct expression of an internal logic that seeks to eliminate any element that does not fit into her vision of absolute control and a perfect, pure world, free from impurities. She genuinely believes that she is cleansing the system, eliminating disturbances, undesirable influences, and lies that, in her distorted perception, threaten the stability and integrity of wizarding society. To understand this internal logic and the structure of her psyche, we can turn to the psychology of authoritarianism, a field of study that delves into the characteristics of individuals and systems that exhibit tendencies of control and oppression. Theodore Adorno and his colleagues, in their seminal research on the authoritarian personality after World War II, describe traits such as cognitive rigidity, blind submission to authority, aggression towards minority groups or others, and a strong tendency to view the world in dichotomous terms of black and white, right and wrong, without nuances or complexity. Umbridge exhibits these characteristics in a blatant and disturbing way. Her unquestioning and even subservient submission to the Minister for Magic, her relentless persecution of mudbloods, centaurs, and other magical creatures considered inferior or impure, and her absolute intolerance of any form of dissent or critical thinking. She operates on the premise that uniformity is synonymous with security, and that any deviation from this norm is an existential threat to be neutralized, no matter the human or moral cost. Punishment for her is not just a means of correcting undesirable behavior. It is a tool to break the spirit, impose total submission, and eradicate any form of resistance or individuality. She does not see evil in herself, but in others, in those who refuse to submit to her order. Imagine an operating system that, instead of correcting flaws or adapting to new information and needs, ignores, suppresses, and forcibly imposes its own version of normality, eliminating any program or file that does not fit its rigid code. This is how Umbridge's mind operates. She does not perceive evil in her own actions, but rather a necessary, noble, and even heroic service to maintain the integrity of a system she considers superior, unquestionable, and, above all, correct. Her cruelty is not impulsive, but methodical, part of a larger plan to mold the world in her image of perfection and absolute control. The coldness with which she applies her punishments, the chilling calm with which she imposes them, and her unshakable conviction that she is doing good are the most terrifying elements of her psychology. It was not madness in the sense of mental imbalance or irrationality. It was cold calculation, based on an unshakable belief in her own version of the truth, a truth that justified oppression in the name of an order she considered perfect, unquestionable, and essential for the survival of her world. Her cruelty was logic taken to the extreme. The point of no return for Dolores Umbridge is not a single, isolated act of explicit malice, but a series of cumulative transgressions that, step by step, solidify her position as a figure of oppression and tyranny. The imposition of her educational decrees at Hogwarts, with the suppression of essential classes like defense against the dark arts, the systematic persecution of students and teachers who showed any sign of independence, critical thinking, or resistance, and the transformation of the curriculum into a tool for ideological indoctrination, mark this crucial turning point. She seeks not only to control what is taught, but the very essence of education, transforming an environment that should be one of learning, growth, and freedom into a regime of fear, conformity, and silence. The use of the infamous black quill, which not only records the students' words on parchment, but painfully carves them into their skin, is a cruel, shocking, and sadistic example of how she crosses all ethical and human boundaries in her pursuit of total submission. At this stage, Umbridge's worldview crystallizes into a perverse logic where the end justifies the means, and order is the sole virtue and supreme value. Morality, ethics, compassion, and empathy are replaced by a distorted rationalization that her actions, no matter how cruel, inhumane, and unjust, are absolutely necessary to protect wizarding society from dangerous ideas, undesirable elements, and the lie of Voldemort's return. For her, order, blind obedience, and conformity are the supreme virtues, and any deviation from them is a grave moral failing, a rebellion to be crushed without mercy. This leads us to a disturbing and profoundly human dilemma, where she was genuinely convinced that she was acting correctly, that she was the hero of her own story, saving the wizarding world from an invisible and subversive threat. Psychologically, this escalation can be explained by the spiral of commitment and the dehumanization of the other. Once Umbridge commits to an authoritarian and repressive course of action, She continues to justify it, increasing the intensity of her measures to maintain the internal coherence of her beliefs and to silence any doubts that might arise. The dehumanization of her opponents, be they half-giants like Hagrid, mudbloods like Hermione, or teachers who dare to disagree like Dumbledore, allows her to treat them with cruelty, contempt, and a complete lack of remorse or guilt. They are not seen as individuals with feelings, rights, dignity, or a valid perspective, but as mere obstacles to be removed, as pests to be eradicated in the name of her superior order. This is the cold, relentless logic of many authoritarian regimes that, throughout history, have justified unspeakable atrocities in the name of an ideology, a racial purity, a national security, or a fabricated social order. The ability to dehumanize the adversary, to transform them into something less than human, is one of the most dangerous pillars of tyranny. The question that echoes, not only in the corridors of Hogwarts, but in the mind of anyone observing this ascent, is disturbing and universal. How can such a fervent belief in order and tradition lead to such cruelty, such a denial of reality, and such a complete suppression of humanity? The answer lies in how power corrupts and how ideology distorts perception. Delving deeper into the psychological analysis, Dolores Umbridge's actions are not the product of an irrational, unbalanced mind or a fit of madness in the common sense. They make a frighteningly logical and coherent sense within her own system of distorted and prejudiced beliefs and values. She is not mad in the sense of being disconnected from reality. Her mind operates with a cold, methodical, and calculated rationality aimed at maintaining power, hierarchical structure, and the ideology she considers ideal and unquestionable. This mental rigidity, this intolerance of ambiguity, and this inability to empathize can be understood through the concept of distorted social cognition. Umbridge filters all information and interactions in a way that confirms her pre-existing beliefs about the need for control, the inferiority of certain groups, and the superiority of her own worldview, ignoring, reinterpreting, or even fabricating evidence that contradicts them. She lives in a bubble of self-deception and self-justification. Studies on authoritarian personalities and social conformity reveal patterns of behavior that perfectly align with Umbridge's conduct. Individuals with this predisposition frequently possess a strong aversion to ambiguity, uncertainty, and change, preferring clear hierarchical structures, strict rules, and a well-defined, immutable social order. Her blind adherence to ministerial decrees, her insistence on rigid discipline, and her intolerance of any form of deviation reflect this profound need for predictability and control. She sees the world as a series of clear and immutable categories, the right and the wrong. This dichotomous view allows no room for nuance, empathy, compassion, or understanding of different perspectives, rendering her impervious to others' arguments and feelings. We can draw parallels with Max Weber's theory of bureaucracy, where the pursuit of efficiency, rationality, and conformity to rules can lead to depersonalization, disregard for human impact, and moral blindness. Umbridge is the embodiment of this bureaucracy taken to the extreme, where procedure, decree, and rule become more important than compassion, justice, or humanity itself. Her actions are not uncontrolled outbursts of anger, but deliberate and calculated acts to achieve her goals of control and suppression. Comparing her to historical figures who advocated oppressive regimes, we see a recurring pattern: an unshakable belief in one's own moral righteousness, the justification of cruelty in the name of a higher ideal, and the ability to view others as mere instruments or obstacles to be removed. The coldness with which she applies her punishments, the chilling calm with which she imposes them, and her unshakable conviction that she is doing good are the most terrifying elements of her psychology. She feels no guilt because, in her mental universe, she is the victim or the savior, never the perpetrator. It was not madness in the sense of mental imbalance or irrationality. It was cold calculation, based on unshakable belief in her own version of the truth, a truth that justified oppression in the name of an order she considered perfect, unquestionable, and essential for the survival of her world. Her cruelty was logic taken to the extreme. What remains after the curtain falls on Dolores Umbridge's era at Hogwarts and, subsequently, at the Ministry of Magic? Her tenure, though relatively brief in terms of time, left deep scars on the institution and on those who inhabited it. However, and paradoxically, her tyranny also sparked fierce resistance, an unexpected unity, and a reaffirmation of values that ultimately strengthened the spirit of those she tried to oppress and silence. The legacy of chaos and oppression she instigated was not total and permanent submission, but the reaffirmation of the importance of freedom of expression, the pursuit of truth, solidarity among the oppressed, and the ability to question authority, especially when it becomes tyrannical and unjust. Her downfall, though belated, represented a victory not only over her as an individual, but over the authoritarian ideology she represented and personified. Her story invites us to a crucial philosophical and moral reflection that transcends fiction. Who are we to judge? When conviction can be so strong as to blind an individual to the reality of others and justify cruelty. Umbridge's trajectory reminds us that danger does not reside only in explicit monsters, in villains who openly declare themselves evil and violent. Danger often lies in those who dress in normalcy, who smile and use sweet words while implementing measures that harm human dignity, who justify oppression in the name of a particular order, a tradition, or a fabricated security. She is a mirror to the most dangerous face of authoritarianism, the one that hides under the cloak of legitimacy, bureaucracy, and apparent benevolence. The consequences of her actions extend beyond fiction, echoing disturbingly in reality. Human history shows us countless examples of how authoritarianism, disguised in various forms from totalitarian political regimes to everyday microaggressions and veiled prejudices, can erode democratic institutions, undermine social trust, fragment human coexistence, and suppress individuality. The figure of Umbridge serves as a constant warning about the necessary vigilance against the suppression of individuality, the denial of diversity, and the unchecked pursuit of control and power. She teaches us that true strength lies not in imposition by force, but in peaceful resistance, in defending fundamental human values, and in the courage to speak truth to power. But perhaps she was not the last to try to impose her worldview through control and oppression, using bureaucracy as a weapon. And vigilance, the ability to discern the true nature of power and resist its corruption, is a lesson that echoes through time, more relevant than ever, a cycle that demands our constant attention. The deep journey into the mind and actions of Dolores Umbridge has revealed that authoritarianism is not a distant phenomenon or limited to great tyrants, but a complex and insidious manifestation that can infiltrate any sphere of life, disguising itself as normalcy. Her story is a poignant reminder. Blind conformity, the denial of truth, the dehumanization of the other, and the relentless pursuit of control, even if disguised as good intentions and saccharine smiles, can generate the cruelest and most silent forms of oppression. May this analysis serve as a mirror, prompting us to question, to resist, and to always defend freedom of thought and human dignity. After all, appearances can be deceiving, but actions and the psychology behind them reveal the true and disturbing face of power that hides beneath the veil of order.